Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valan Kolika, and I'll be your host for today. I'm also joined here by my co-host Ashley Martin and Jason Cohen. Just a few reminders before we start. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and are using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you use the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community page at aka.ms/securitycommunity. Closed captions in several languages are available during the live broadcast, and you can enable them by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask a Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can also post your questions anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. And if time permits, towards the end of the webinar, we will verbalize some of your questions to our speaker. And now into the topic. Back in August, we covered the special report on Ukraine. In fact, this was our honored guest who covered the topic. And today, Tom Burt is back with us again and will be providing a comprehensive overview on the latest Microsoft Digital Defense report. Tom is our CVP of Customer Security and Trust. And without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Tom. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Valan. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you again today. I'm going to share my presentation here and really look forward to the chance to provide a high-level summary of this year's Microsoft Digital Defense report. The report is our effort, as you may know, our annual effort to pull together from across all of Microsoft what we are seeing in the cybersecurity landscape and what our customers, policymakers, leaders around the world should know that we can see, that we can provide as information to help guide both our awareness and provide awareness as to what's happening, as well as help guide policy determinations and decisions by customers. And so the report has 132 Microsoft contributors and 5 different chapters. And as you will see in the report, each chapter begins with an introduction from a different cybersecurity leader. And that really reflects the fact that this report is a collaboration across the entire cybersecurity community at Microsoft. Anne Barosian, who's on the call on my team, is the power behind the Microsoft Digital Defense report. She works across all these teams to pull together this information, to get the introductions written by the leaders, and to work with our vendors to create what I think this year is a particularly engaging and interesting report. But it really takes everyone across the community to provide the content that makes up this report. And many of you on the call today may have been involved or been on teams that were involved in helping contribute this information. One of the reasons we provide the report and make it public is because of the unique perspective that Microsoft has that's driven by the 43 trillion signals that we get from our ecosystem every day. The huge investment that we make in cybersecurity with the engineers, researchers, and many others from my teams, from engineering teams, from across the company. And of course, because of the breadth and the scale of our ecosystem and the innovation that we bring to bear in helping protect our customers, we have the ability to talk about how we've blocked 37 billion email threats or identity threats over the course of the year, that we analyze 2.5 billion endpoint signals every day. It's the scale, the massive scale of the work that we do across the company that helps inform the Microsoft Digital Defense report. And I can tell you from the responses we've gotten already from the publication of the report. Once again, it's being viewed as a significant and useful contribution to the understanding of what's happening in the cybersecurity landscape. So let me talk first about cybercrime. This is the first chapter in the report. And while nation state activity often drives a lot of the headlines that we see, we also know that in terms of the impact on our customers day to day, cybercrime is a more significant concern than nation state activity. And the trends that we are seeing that we're reporting in the MDDR this year start with this very concerning trend, which has been building over the last several years, but is particularly notable this year, which is the trend towards cybercrime as a service, where the major cybercrime syndicates are actually operating as commercial enterprises. They advertise their capabilities, the services they can provide in the dark web, and it enables a much broader scale and a much broader community of cyber criminals to engage in cybercrime. You don't have to have technical expertise to do this. You can simply engage one of these syndicates to provide the services you need. That might just be you want their payload, or you might want an end-to-end ransomware engagement where the syndicate provides all components of that, and your role is simply to identify the victims and to conduct the negotiation and to manage the payment that you're going to receive from your victims. And as a result, what we're seeing is a significant ongoing increase in cybercrime, both in terms of the volume of cybercrime activity and its economic impact. And we are seeing a significant success rate. And while you might say that 1 out of 60 encounters being a successful ransom, it may not be that high a success rate. It's a really, really significant success rate when you consider how these ransomware operators engage, and the fact that they engage at a very high scale with in some cases it's phishing, but most often it's password spray or brute force attacks in order to gain the credentials they need to get into the target environment. Once they get in, and you see roughly a third of those they target, they successfully compromise. And then 5% of those, 1 out of those 20, they get a payment from. What this leads to is billions of dollars of successful ransomware theft every year. And the capability of enabling many, many criminals to engage in this form of cybercrime. What we also see is that the syndicates and those who are engaged in ransomware campaigns tend to identify a specific sector of a geography or of the economy, and they will target multiple different victims within that sector serially as they work their way through the sector. Presumably they do that because they do engage in very substantial research into the sector that they're targeting, into the specific companies that they're targeting, because human operated ransomware, where there's actually a criminal on the other side of the keyboard engaging in the negotiation, has become the dominant form of ransomware we see in the ecosystem. And that human operated ransomware has as a key characteristic much higher demand for ransom than we saw back when all ransomware was much more an automated approach, and the demand that you would get with your ransomware note would be a relatively small number of Bitcoin. Now the operators know their victim finances, they know what they can afford to pay, and they make very large demands and negotiate for very significant payments, which has significantly increased the economic impact of ransomware. As you can see from this slide, the criminals have just in the last year engaged in attacks across a wide range of activities and economic sectors, but they do tend to work one at a time by actor, and probably because that helps them ensure that they are extracting as much money from their victims as they can. Now, while ransomware gets a lot of attention, in part because of its prevalence, its growth, the impact of human-operated ransomware, and also we increasingly see nation states utilizing ransomware as part of their attack, and I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. We shouldn't ignore business email compromise. This is just straight up fraud, which is enabled by the actor getting into your environment, gaining a credential so that they can take control of an email account, and then they use that access from within an organization to conduct fraud. In many, many cases, it's simply a note that comes from the CEO or some other senior official in an organization to the CFO or treasurer that says, we have this secret deal, it's happening right now, I need you to wire, $1 million to the following account. And then that happens, and of course the account that the money is wired to is the criminal's account. And all of this is dependent upon getting into the network, getting that credential to be able to act as and seize control of an email account and send these trusted notes within an enterprise to get payment made. You can see there's a range of different fraud techniques that these actors use. The dominant one is the one I just described: invoice fraud, payroll redirection, and other forms of business email compromise are also prevalent. What's important to know is that business email compromise represents about half of the total volume of successful theft in the ecosystem. So while ransomware is growing and gets a lot of attention, this remains a very significant concern for our customers and a dominant form of cybercrime in the environment. So let's turn to nation state threats, and let me just stop and parenthetically note that I'm just hitting a couple of the highlights of this year's report, but I absolutely commend to all of you to take a deep dive into the report. We've made some changes to the report this year because while we want to continue to make sure that the report is driven by the data that we have and that we have access to due to our very significant ecosystem, we wanted to highlight the analysis that we could provide of what that data means, what it should mean to our customers. And so you'll see that not only in my introduction, but in each chapter, we've pulled up to the beginning of the chapter a dashboard that highlights the key takeaways, the insights or analysis we think is important for the reader in each chapter. And then the reader can then dive deeper into the chapter and see much more detailed data analysis and analysis from our authors in each of these sections. In the nation state section, obviously, you can't talk about nation state activity in the past year. And keep in mind, the Microsoft Digital Defense Report is for the fiscal year that ended June 30th of 2022. So it's our compilation of everything that we saw in the prior fiscal year. But you can't talk about nation state threats in that fiscal year without talking about the hybrid war in Ukraine. And we survey in the MDDR all of our activity in supporting the defense of Ukraine against Russian cyber activity, as well as the ways in which we see that cyber activity apparently coordinated with the kinetic activity as part of this hybrid war. And that's discussed in some depth in the report. It talks about how Microsoft first got engaged, how we've created a encrypted channel of communication between our threat intelligence team through me to cybersecurity officials in Ukraine, where we provide 24/7 daily threat intelligence tips to help inform Ukraine when they're under attack or where an organization or an enterprise in Ukraine has been compromised with threat intelligence from the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. Mystic does a great job providing not just a notification that you are threatened by a particular actor, but threat intelligence to help the defenders in Ukraine find the actor, block them or get them out of their environments. And so we're passing that information on a regular basis. It's almost daily. In some cases, as the war has gone on, it's been multiple times a day. Sometimes we've had several days with no new threats that we've detected, but it's an ongoing and consistent process that we remain very engaged in. I sent a couple of new threats just yesterday. Won't be surprised if there's more that pop up during the day today. We've also worked with the Ukrainian government with their consent and permission using the Risk IQ technology that we acquired with the Risk IQ to engage in a scan of all the endpoints, open endpoints across all government agencies, and provide Ukraine early on in the conflict with a report of where they had unpatched vulnerabilities exposed across all their government agencies. And then the government they found that so valuable, the government came back to us several months later and asked for us to redo that scan and give them a new report, which we did, which, as you might expect, showed that some agencies were doing a great job and some agencies were not doing such a great job. And that helped the cybersecurity officials there really focus on where they're most vulnerable and how to apply their resources. And we also helped them with what we called countermeasures, where we actually, with permission of government, pushed onto government devices and critical infrastructure devices, we pushed code that would help defend against the particular form of wiper malware that the Russian actors were using. And that's what we saw. We saw the very best Russian team, a team we call Iridium, associated with the Russian GRU. That's their military intelligence operation. And that's the organization within Russian intelligence that's been responsible for all their destructive malware, their most impressive destructive malware over the years, including the malware they used for the NotPetya attack, which was wormable so that it rapidly expanded its economic impact outside the geographic border of Ukraine, to the other destructive malware they've deployed over time in Ukraine, and then the wiper malware that they have been utilizing in their attacks in Ukraine. And this hasn't been a static battle. As we've worked, and the defenders, the really excellent job the defenders in Ukraine are doing to defend against these attacks, and as we've identified the wiper and built signatures into Defender and otherwise helped defend against them, the Russian team continues to evolve. So I think they're in either a generation 7 or 8 of the form of wiper malware that they're using as they evolve their malware to try to evade detections, try to evade signatures, and work around the defenses that we're helping Ukraine create. So it's an ongoing full-scale cyber war that's happening in Ukraine. And that's all reported in some detail. In addition to Ukraine, where Microsoft remains very committed to helping the defense of Ukraine, you may have seen news reports that we have committed to continue supporting Ukraine with their move to our cloud through the end of next calendar year. So the total value of the technical and humanitarian aid that we have now provided to Ukraine is over $400 million. But in addition to what we see happening in Ukraine, Mystic continues to track nation-state actors around the globe. And we summarize those key nation-state actors in the MDDR, the targets that they typically go after and that we've seen them go after over the prior year, and other useful information for customers and how to think about the impact of these nation-state actors. The vast majority of nation-state attacks are not destructive, but are intended to gather intelligence or intellectual property. And you see that across all of the actors listed here. These are the ones that we highlight in this year's MDDR. And as always, there's a number from Russia, from Iran, from North Korea, and from China. We often will also highlight a nation state actor from one or two other geographies as we see these capabilities proliferate. And this time there's one from Lebanon, Polonium, that we highlight in addition to the actors from the key 4 other countries. And then we talk about what we're seeing. An awful lot of the Russian activity has been clearly in support of the hybrid war in Ukraine, including their intelligence gathering activities. But they also continue to engage in other surveillance and intelligence gathering activities, not so clearly connected to Ukraine. We've seen an increase in Chinese activity, broadly gathering broadly gathering surveillance and intelligence across a wide range of both commercial and governmental targets of interest to China. The one I want to particularly call out is the activity we've seen from Iran, as we've seen Iran become increasingly aggressive in its activity. If you roll the clock back to the prior Microsoft Digital Defense report, we saw Iran quite active, but mostly active in conducting surveillance activities of the energy sector and other government targets in the Middle East region, or those influential in policy in the Middle East. But over the past year, we saw a significant expansion in their activity, targeting organizations outside the Middle East and across more different enterprises and governments, but also more destructive activity, especially an ongoing cyber war that they are having with Israel. And we saw Iranian actors begin to use ransomware both to get money, but also just as a tool to engage in destructive attacks. And even since the MDDR was published, we've seen this continue as Iran becomes more engaged in destructive attacks, not just with Israel, but with Albania. And we did a special report on that particular engagement. So we see a much more aggressive level of activity coming from nation state actors in Iran. Another disturbing trend that's reported on in some detail in the MDDR is the speed with which new 0 days are being exploited by actors. And so the timelines that are displayed here are becoming shorter and shorter over time. From when we release a patch and publicly disclose a new vulnerability to the time in which we see that vulnerability being exploited by adversaries in the wild is down to 14 days. Down to 60 days by the time we see proof of concept code released on GitHub. And yet it takes as much as 120 days before we see it available in scanning tools. And so what we see from this is increased risk in the ecosystem from new 0 days because of the rapidity with which actors seize on those and utilize them for whatever purposes they can based on the nature of that vulnerability. And we see this in particular with Chinese actors. The vast majority of cyber criminal activity and nation state activity, the initial entry point into the target's ecosystem, into their network, is through an identity-based attack, whether that's phishing, password spray, or brute force. That's the approach that's utilized in most cases. And it's utilized because it's easy, it's cheap, and it works. And they, as we all know, they only need to be successful once to get into the ecosystem, and then they begin to pivot within that network to go after whatever they're most interested in, whether that's the extraction of data, or dropping malware for a destructive purpose, or ransomware, or whatever it may be. But that's how they mostly get in. We see Chinese more often utilizing 0 days, and other actors also using 0-day vulnerabilities, but especially the Chinese actors. And we believe the Chinese are likely warehousing 0-day vulnerabilities for potential future use. The Chinese government, I think it's about 1.5 years, it may now be as much as 2 years ago, adopted new law that require any Chinese organization or enterprise that becomes aware of a 0-day vulnerability to first disclose it to the Chinese government before they disclose it through any other form of responsible disclosure. And as a result, we feel confident that the Chinese are building a warehouse of these 0-day vulnerabilities for future potential use. We also are seeing the landscape spanning the globe. As has been the case in the past, the US and British enterprises and government organizations are high on the list of the most targeted countries. And of course, Ukraine has stepped up in terms of how often it's targeted because of the impact of the hybrid war in Ukraine. But we see across Europe and more broadly across Asia and really around the globe, the nation state actors seeking information, gathering intelligence from organizations and enterprises of interest without really there being any significant part of the globe in which that activity is not occurring. We are also seeing a trend towards more and more targeting of critical infrastructure. And while to date that's largely not destructive, it certainly raises the concern that this activity is being conducted preparatory to being capable, to building the capability by adversaries to be able to successfully attack and disable critical infrastructure at some point should that be necessary in the future. And we saw the percentage of the nation state notifications that we do when we notify our customers that we see that they are threatened or compromised by a nation state actor. We saw the percentage of those nation state notifications involving critical infrastructure organizations increase from 20% to 40% year over year. The activity that we've seen Russia engage in Ukraine, to go back to that for a moment, is very broad, has been very broad across a wide range of sectors within Ukraine. And, you know, understandably, they've gone after government to gather intelligence and information. But when you think about the destructive attacks that they've engaged in and how they have been closely coordinated, both in geography, in target, and in apparent strategy with the kinetic activity, you see that the destructive attacks have included nuclear facilities, the IT sector, increasingly in the last couple of months, as we've seen the Russians trying to disable the electrical system in Ukraine with their missile attacks. We've also seen cyber attacks on the energy sector. Earlier, we saw both kinetic and cyber attacks on the water utility and water sector. Earlier in the conflict, we saw both military and cyber attacks against media as Russia tried to control the communications and media within Ukraine, which they were not successful in doing to the extent that they wished. But it's a broad range of attacks, very much focused most recently on energy and water, and so that's just another component of that hybrid war. Let me turn now to the next chapter of the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, which is a chapter on devices and infrastructure. And this is because we did see a clear trend of two things. First of all, increasing nation-state interest in IoT devices and industrial control devices. And so we present our analysis of how that is an increasing trend and one of concern across the globe. And we see governments very concerned about this, especially because so much of both, critical infrastructure, the provision of critical services to citizens, and core manufacturing capabilities are dependent on these devices. And what we've seen as we've increased our analysis and communicated with governments and externally about this trend is a significant increase in the extent to which governments are evolving policies and regulations to try to manage this risk. And to one extent, that's a good thing. To another extent, as is typical when we see these kinds of trends in the regulatory environment, there is not good coordination among the various governments as to how to do this regulation, which creates a very difficult environment for our customers, especially our multinational customers, but also a difficult environment for us and other multinational technology companies as we have to comply with many different regulatory regimes, sometimes conflicting and overlapping regulatory regimes across the countries as these are developed. And one particular example of that is this increasing trend in laws that require the reporting of cyber incidents. Now, we actively supported legislation in the United States to have mandatory cyber incident reporting, and legislation was adopted making that mandatory within critical infrastructure sectors, subject to ongoing rulemaking that's underway now as to exactly what's going to trigger the beginning of that reporting requirement and which organizations and enterprises are subject to that reporting requirement. But we supported that because there is a problem that government has and that the ecosystem has in really knowing the full scale and nature of the cyber attacks that are occurring, because many organizations and enterprises are reluctant to report when they have been the subject of an attack for a variety of different reasons. So making that reporting mandatory and effectively protecting against liability for those reports was an important step to take. In the US, we lobbied for a incident reporting time of at least 72 hours, so that from whatever and however the beginning of the reporting requirement becomes defined, you would then have 72 hours before you had to submit the report. And we did that because we saw in other geographies much different, shorter timelines. So in Australia, for example, certain incidents have to be reported within 24 hours. And even worse, in India, there are incidents that have to be reported within 6 hours. As we know from our extensive work, both helping customers, but also responding to incidents where Microsoft is under attack by a threat actor, we know that in those early hours of responding, it's very much the fog of war. And our teams are working hard to really understand what's happening in this environment, who's attacking us, what malware are they using, what's the, how did they get in, how can we identify where they are, and get them out of our environment. And all of that work is very challenging in the early hours and days of responding to any significant incident. And that means if the reporting time is too short, you're not only going to be distracting your defenders from the work they need to be doing, identifying the attack and defending against it and expelling the actor from your network and environment, but you're also likely to be getting reports that are erroneous, that are misinformation. One example of that just recently was the attack in Albania, destructive attack against government agencies there. And I got a call from the cybersecurity national security advisor to the president. And she said, "Are you seeing this? What's happening in Albania? It looks like it's the Russians expanding outside of Ukraine." And we were able to very quickly say, we actually don't think it's the Russians. We're seeing other signals that suggest that it may be a different attacker. And very shortly after that, we were able to say, we feel confident that it's Iran and not Russia. And then within about 72 hours, we were able to actually publish a report, a detailed report, attributing the attack to a particular activity group in Iran, and actually being able to identify the motive for the attack, that Iran was responding to Albania harboring a dissident organization called MEK, which itself had been engaged in some cyber attacks in Iran. And that took time to be able to gather the intelligence and the confidence to be able to issue that kind of report. And it's that kind of intelligence that's going to be most useful to governments and to others in the ecosystem, not early on seat of the pants reactions that maybe this is Russia or some other actor when that's not actually what's happening. Just some data about what we're seeing happening in the IoT and OT environment, the types of attacks that we're seeing. And you notice that the vast majority are remote management attacks, but also web attacks are significant vectors for the attacks into these devices. And while in the past we saw these devices being attacked primarily to harness their somewhat limited computing power to support DDoS attacks, we're now increasingly seeing these attacks as means of entry into an environment. So the actors have discovered that because IoT and OT devices are often connected to a network that's an intended victim and frequently have a low degree of security, they are an attractive entry point for an attacker to gain access to a network and then move and pivot within that network to where they're really interested in gathering information or conducting a ransomware attack or whatever they may be doing. And we are seeing these vulnerabilities across these devices because of a lot of the security weaknesses we see in firmware and weak passwords or known vulnerabilities in devices. And frequently these devices are not easily patched to address known vulnerabilities, which is one of the many areas where regulators are increasing their focuses to require that devices be, have a security a methodology so they can be patched. And the people who deploy these devices need to change the default password that comes with them. Devices are often very vulnerable to just being attacked using default passwords like password, and because people will put them in their network and not change that default password. So there's a lot of risk in these devices, and there's a great degree to which the challenge faced by increasing the security of the existing installed base is very challenging. We can do more with new devices that have better security systems built into those devices, but the installed base is massive and is growing rapidly with devices with weak security. We talk now in the next chapter about cyber influence operations, and this is a new area of investment for Microsoft, and in particular in my team. We acquired a company called Maburo, and we brought that company into my team and created a new team that we call the Microsoft the Digital Threat Analysis Center, or DTAC. And that combines these analysts who look at and analyze influence operations by nation states, seeking to influence public opinion and decision making and create discord and conflict in the liberal democracies of the world. We look at that in detail, and we combined it with the threat context analysts that we already had working closely with Mystic. And that's our team of analysts who came from the security community, the intelligence community, and have language skills and the capability of looking at threat intelligence and providing analysis as to what's happening, what the motivation of the actor might be, what our customers should know about their future risk based on the activity that we see in the environment. And our more recent reports, as you've probably seen, but you'll see increasingly, are going to combine the cybersecurity threat intelligence with intelligence and understanding about these influence operations, in some cases because we see those coordinated, but also because we see them as incredibly effective tools that our adversaries are using in different ways to have impact on our customers and on the global community. Just one example of this is RT.com, which is a Russian state-controlled outlet that is known to be very active in not only distributing news, but also Russian propaganda. And one of the analyses that we did looked at the difference between the messages that were being communicated through RT in their Russian language outlets, which were very much about the importance of vaccination and the risks of COVID, compared to what they said in all of their English outlets, which was to denigrate the effectiveness of vaccinations, to suggest that even the vaccines were part of a global conspiracy of some form, and to also minimize the impact and significance of COVID as a disease in the first place. And this is just one example of how you can detect these influence operations and how propaganda is being utilized by nation state actors to achieve their public policy objectives. A data science team in SELA, the AI for Good team, has been working closely with us to provide data analysis of what we're seeing. And one of the things we've created is this thing we're calling the Russian Propaganda Index. And it's comparing the consumption of known Russian propaganda outlets to other consumption of news and information from websites across the internet. And what we see is that these propaganda sites, even within the United States, have a pretty big audience, and that audience spiked when Russia invaded Ukraine. And while it's fallen off, it's still at a higher level today than it was before the invasion. And we are working to understand, what we can learn from the consumption of Russian propaganda, and it won't be limited just to Russia, but this is where we started with this work. How they engage in these influence operations, what the techniques they are using to amplify their propaganda, and what we can be telling the global community and our customers so that people can be aware of the effect and influence of these influence operations. The Russians are particularly skilled and adept at this. As we went into the midterm election cycle, we saw for the first time Chinese actors directly engaging in trying to be influential on a particular Senate campaign in Florida. But they had very little effect because their efforts were ham-handed and not sophisticated. And our assessment was that they had very little impact. But the risk is that they're stepping into this arena and they're looking to develop the skills and the capabilities to be more effective at distributing their propaganda. As we step into this area of influence operation, we are taking a very specific approach that is different than our competitors and those who have significant social media sites, where often those social media sites are being utilized to distribute and amplify this propaganda. And many of our competitors are trying to combat this issue, not by changing their algorithms and the way in which their social media platforms work, because that's what helps enable them to have a very successful advertising business and achieve the revenue they're achieving. So they're trying to engage here by hiring huge teams of people to review the accuracy, falsehood, or lack of, or trustworthiness of particular stories or messages, and to then effectively make the technology sector the censor of what the public should be seeing and reading. And you've seen a lot of the press around this, most recently around after Mr. Musk took over Twitter, around the extent to which Twitter repressed or did not repress the New York Post article about the Hunter Biden laptop. And that's just one example of these decisions that big panels of people are making across the social media landscape. The problem with that, of course, is that as soon as you start trying to weigh in as to what's true and what's not true, what should be believed or not be believed, you're stepping into an area that we don't believe. And in my conversations with Brad Smith, Brad and I are very aligned on this. This should not be the role of the technology industry to tell people what they should or should not believe. And so we're being very specific that our objective as we look at influence operations is to identify those messages that are being promulgated by nation state actors, to attribute those messages whenever we can to specific organizations within government, so that for example, that a message that you're reading or that is being amplified and that you're paying attention to was originated by Russian military intelligence, for example, which many of them are. And that we want to shine a light on the techniques that these actors are using to amplify their message and to distribute their message and to have the influence that they're trying to achieve. And then we'll leave it to the reader and the consumer to decide whether or not they want to continue to believe these messages. And we're doing that so that we don't fall into the trap of the polarization that currently occurs when any media company tries to say what is or is not truthful, one side or the other of the political arena then immediately marginalizes that organization, or at least that message, as being political and not associated with whether it's true or not true. Then the final chapter, and hopefully I've saved a little bit of time for Q&A. The final chapter is a great one on cyber resilience. And in this one, what we've basically done is taken all the work that Brett Arsenault and the teams across the company have done to make Microsoft resilient. We get attacked so many times every day by nation state actors and cyber criminals. And we have an incredibly high success record of defending against these attacks due to the work of Brett and his team. And so what we've done this time is we've asked them to write a chapter in which they could communicate to our customers what we are doing to defend against these attacks and what's been successful, what we recommend customers do. And of course, the number one thing is basic cybersecurity hygiene, and especially the adoption of multi-factor authentication. The data still shows that more than 98, I think it's even more than 99% of all cyber criminal and nation state attacks would be prevented if the accounts had multi-factor authentication enabled. And so just that alone, if we could get the percentage of accounts across the ecosystem much more broadly protected with multi-factor authentication, then the volume of successful attacks would plummet. Now, we know that the actors would then pivot to other techniques, some of the techniques that we're already seeing for bypassing multi-factor authentication, or other approaches to attacking to gain access into a target network. And one of the great things that we see at Microsoft, because we are so good at deploying basic cybersecurity hygiene, we are at that leading edge of adversary innovation. We see attacks against our ecosystem that are not being broadly utilized more generally because they're more expensive, they're more challenging, they're experimental and the like. But that enables us to provide distant warnings, early warnings to our customers and the ecosystem about the kinds of attacks that we see forthcoming and how to defend against those, while still reinforcing these key aspects of core hygiene as being the most important things: multi-factor authentication, zero trust principles, using anti-malware, patching your system and doing that rapidly, and making sure that your critical data is properly protected. So that's a quick survey. I'm going to stop my sharing now and open for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for this great information. Anna and the team has been great answering the incoming questions on the chat. But I do have some questions for you if times allow. You're okay with Tom?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. So do we know what proportion of ransomware attacks are human-driven versus the commodity malware?
Yeah, I don't have an actual number for you. We know that the vast majority of ransomware attacks now are human-operated ransomware. There is still some commodity ransomware occurring, but the success and both in terms of the success rate, but more importantly, the price, the ransom payment that a criminal can get is so much greater in the human operated approach that's where the criminals have pivoted. And that's enabled by that factor I talked about at the outset, that as a criminal, you don't even have to have the technical capability to deploy a human operated ransomware attack. You can effectively rent that from providers on the dark web quite readily, and all you have to do is conduct the negotiation and get paid.
I see. Well, thank you for that. You mentioned the hybrid war in Ukraine many times, and of course you covered this thoroughly during the August webinar. And lately there's been public reports about Russia's preparation on cyber attacks against Ukraine this coming winter. Would you be able to share more on that? And perhaps is it only Ukraine under the radar?
That's a great question. And as it happens, we published a report this past weekend, and I think Anne can pop a link up to it in the chat for those who are interested. But it was a relatively lengthy blog from Clint Watts, who leads my new threat intelligence team that I mentioned, the DTAC team, Digital Threat Analysis Center. And in that report, we are looking at what we're seeing in the hybrid war in Ukraine, the focus on critical infrastructure, and especially trying to impose pain on the citizens of Ukraine by disrupting their access to power, to water, and to other basic human services, and how that's being conducted both as a military operation and a cyber operation in a very coordinated way. We also see influence operations in Ukraine from Russian actors that are trying to double down on the lack of success of the Ukrainian government in defending the citizens against these attacks as a means of trying to whip up objections by the citizens to the government's ongoing defense against the Russian invasion. But more problematic, and what we address in the blog in some detail, is the risk that we will see both the influence operations and potentially even destructive cyber operations outside Ukraine. So we did see a few weeks ago the first instance, or actually a couple of months ago now, we saw the first instance of Russian destructive malware being deployed outside Ukraine in support of their war in Ukraine. And that was when the Mystic team identified this new form of ransomware, which called itself Prestige. And we saw it deployed against transportation and logistics companies, both in Ukraine and in Poland, within the same 24-hour period. And the work Mystic did, we were able to attribute that ransomware, the Prestige ransomware, to the same team, the Iridian team, Russian military intelligence team that's been responsible for their destructive malware. Presumably, they were using this form of ransomware, which, although it operated like ransomware and even have a note, of course, their objective is not in any way to get paid, but to simply encrypt critical data to disrupt the transportation and logistics that might be responsible for shipping both military supplies and humanitarian supplies into Ukraine. And Poland is one of the key transportation corridors for which that activity is occurring. And so we saw this disruption occurring at the time we reported on it. But this report highlights the possibility that we may see more destructive attacks, especially against the energy sector in Europe, just as we are seeing in Ukraine. It's less likely to see military attacks because of the immediate reaction that would have to mobilizing NATO and expanding greatly the scope of this conflict. And both sides seem to be intent on avoiding that escalation. But we could very well see an increase in cyber attacks in the energy sector, intended to, again, increase the disruption and discomfort of citizens of Europe, and maybe especially in Germany, where they are most impacted by the disruption of natural gas flow from Russia. And we think it's not at all unlikely that we could see increasing cyber activity, and we know that there's a high probability we'll see increasing influence operations across those countries in Europe, especially, that are most supporting the Ukraine defense against the war. And so we published that report because we do see these early indications that cause us concern that we may be seeing this escalation. And one of the things that's very interesting in all of this is we didn't see that much international outcry when we published the destructive attacks on the Polish transportation and logistics companies. And as we say in the report, that may be in part because those companies, with the assistance of Polish government agencies and our assistance, our DART team actually was engaged directly with one of those victims in Poland. The impact of those attacks was we were able to moderate. And so it wasn't a significant logistics disruption, notwithstanding that that was clearly the objective of that deployment of the Prestige malware. And maybe that's why there wasn't a greater outcry. But there's also the possibility, which we've seen in other contexts, that the international geopolitical world is still more willing to accept cyber attacks, cross-border cyber attacks, than cross-border military attacks, even when the consequence, the effect, and the impact on civilians might be very similar in both cases. And that means that the prospect for both cyber attacks and related influence operations in Europe and in Ukraine over the course of this winter could be significant as Russia tries to erode support for the Ukrainian defense.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for a thorough explanation on this. And thank you again for being our repeat guest for our security community here. And to all, so that wraps up all my questions. And to all listeners out there, if you want to help defend the world against cyber attacks and want to influence our designs, plans, and guidance, so we can have a global impact together, then please join our security community. This is also where you'll be notified about the upcoming webinars, such as the one like this, other events and announcements. Then please follow us on aka.ms/security community. Also, please take a minute submitting your webinar feedback at aka.ms/security webinar feedback. Thank you all for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.